We're live. Welcome, everyone. This is Lockdown Learning Live. My name is Lee. I'm a flight instructor at Sling Pilot Academy, which teaches pilots all the way from private up to multi-engine instructor in preparation for them to go on to the airlines. A little bit of talk since we're, for most of us, maybe going back to life, back to the world, back to work maybe. I'm still at home, so some of you may be as well. And, I'm pretty happy at home. But for the lucky few who get to go back to work, that's great. I'm glad for those of you who are still at home, welcome. In terms of the airlines, it is projected that the airlines are going to have a downturn. But from the models, it looks like there's a 2 or 3 year comeback period, which is pretty much the amount of time it takes for you to get trained up and the hours to join the airline. So now is not a bad time to start. Anyways, today we will be talking about, let's see if I can get this rolling here. Ooh. What creates turbulence? All right. This will be a little bit of a talk on turbulence in terms of like airlines hitting turbulence, and also a little bit of talk on like flow over a wing as well. We'll talk about mixing of flows, the Kanata Effect, pressure drag, laminar flow, and then the all confusing boundary layer. So let's get rolling. Woo! Okay, we're back. So let me get my screen all set up here. It's acting a little funny on me. Get you big. Oof. Nice and big. Okay, so things we're talking about today, what creates turbulence. First, we're going to talk about flow mixing, which is essentially the big problem with what we all think about when we think about turbulence. Turbulence in an airliner where we're, flying along and it hits, we get bumpy and the seatbelt sign comes on and all that kind of stuff. So as you can see here, I've drawn a little depiction of an airplane flying through some air. There's some air above in blue that's going some direction and speed, and some air below in red that's going some different direction and speed. Those two air masses, I say air masses because it's like a grouping of air. It's a mass of air that's moving. So those two air masses at some point have to mix together. So I've drawn here kind of a little depiction of what's going on when they need to mix. Okay, sometimes there's a stabilized flow across this dotted black line with the airplane. And if we cross from one air mass in red to another air mass in blue, then we could see some kind of different lift characteristics, and then that would create some turbulence. If there's mixing that occurs, which is more in this middle area, or I'm sorry, to the right, then that will create turbulence in a larger area. So the flow mixing creates a lot of what we think of as turbulence in the air when you're in an airliner that is up high. Again, there is some turbulence that could be associated with this aircraft flying into this other air mass from the lower air mass because there's a change in direction of airflow. And there's also other types of turbulence. We might touch on them later, but I wanted to talk more today about how turbulence and how that word is sometimes confused when we talk about airflow over an airfoil and kind of what goes on there. So here's our airfoil over here to the right, just drawn here to show you guys the flow going over. It's similar to that dotted line, right? We have some kind of split in flow. And then, of course, as we talked about last time and time before, if we change that direction of flow and it goes up this airfoil a little bit, then we can also create a different speed. And then below you have another different speed. And then, of course, spoiler, on the back end, those flows have to come together. So let's move into the Kanata Effect. I actually don't know how to Koanyad. I don't know how to pronounce his name, honestly. But this is a pretty straightforward concept. All right, so I've drawn a kind of poorly depicted fan here that's blowing some air. Okay, and then there's basically free stream. This is all free up here. So you may hear me. Oh, I really goofed up on that drawing. You may hear me referring to flow up here, and I apologize for the drawing. I'm in Microsoft Paint, and it's it's really hard to draw. All right, so I'll sometimes refer to this flow up here as free stream flow, and then some kind of other flow that's happening, right? So up here in the free stream flow, nothing's happening. But down here, after the fan acts on some air, then it creates some kind of stream of air that happens. And that's what streamlines come from, that same concept where we're talking about a stream, kind of like a river stream. It's just like a body of air moving. It's a fluid, essentially. As you can see with the red lines, what the air wants to do is it wants to join into the moving flow, kind of like a river tributary, or like a river running down in a valley, and then all the flow kind of comes into it from the mountains, and then it ends up in the same flow. Same thing with air. It does the same stuff. You can think about air and water both as a fluid that act similarly. So the reason I say that, just real quick, is because it's really hard to visualize air because you can't really see it. You can only see its effect. You can only see it moving a leaf or doing some sort of other thing. Whereas water, you can actually see it moving. So it's easier to visualize that way. So here's our river moving, and then our mountains, and we're in a valley here in the blue. Basically, the air wants to join up and move with it. Okay, so what happens here when flow goes around an object like this little circle I've drawn is it actually sucks that air to the object. That's a little bit weird to think about, but that's essentially what happens. There's all sorts of pressure differences happening here. But if you think about it in terms of the way this air has to flow, the air actually gets stuck to the object as it flows around it, and that is attached flow. So you'll hear me talk about attached flow. This is what I'm talking about. Flow that's moving across a body, an object, but staying on it and not going in some sort of weird direction. It could bounce off the object, right? If you shoot a big stream of water with your hose at your cat or something and it hits the cat, it's going to bounce off. It's not going to go around it. But this flow is actually binding to the object essentially and going around it. So if something happens here with our object with the flow that does not go around it, okay, you can see here that we have some flow coming in, and then what's going to happen is it's going to hit the object at some point, right? Like it bouncing off the cat. Same type of thing. The flow is going to hit the object, and it's going to have to go somewhere. Some of it goes around the object and creates attached flow, but some of it actually hits the object, and then it creates pressure, right? It bounces, it moves around, and it's trying to go somewhere, can't go anywhere. And we kind of talked about this with the shock waves, is if it can't go anywhere, it just kind of like builds up and creates pressure. So this is just flow building up and creating pressure on the front end of the object. If we create pressure on the front end of the object, and I'll try to zoom in here to get a little bit better depiction of my little lines. So, and I apologize for the quality. I wasn't able to use the little whiteboard function I was before. Technical difficulties every time we do this. Every time. Anyways, so here we go. We got pressure, and I draw a big P here on this left side. And then on the right side, we have a little p, and then some kind of movement of flow back there. Essentially, what's happening as the air comes over top of the object here, we get the air flowing over top, wanting to go to the lower pressure zone, right? We talked about high pressure always wanting to go to low pressure. Always equalization. Everything in this world, always equalization. So as the pressure comes over the top and it's got this high pressure, it wants to go to the low pressure, and then it kind of like does this circling effect. This is essentially what pressure drag is. Okay, so if there's a difference in pressure on each side of the body, then the flow has a trouble mixing together, and then it creates pressure drag. And essentially, we want to minimize pressure drag. If we come over here, let me zoom out a little bit. We'll talk about, oh, well, this is quite a situation. How do I, oh, there we go. Okay, so here's a little depiction of our airfoil and how this applies to the airplane. We have in the front here some pressure being created, and we also have that free stream flow coming and joining up. This creates attached flow, just like in the other object, and that's important to us. Attached smooth flow is laminar flow. So you'll hear me talk about laminar. Laminar flow, if I say laminar, that's essentially what I'm talking about, attached smooth flow. So we have attached smooth flow here. It's getting really hot in here. I need to turn on my AC. So we have attached smooth laminar flow here coming over the wing. Now, if we do something kind of silly with the design of the wing, then on the back side, on the very right side, we could create pressure drag if we have too bulbous of a or too big of a object in the front. If it's too blunt at the front, then we create a lot of bunching at the front and pressure drag happens. We want the flows to come together at similar pressures, similar speeds, because then we don't have some sort of weird mixing at the back, right? So the reason that an airfoil is curved at the back this way is it's trying to dissipate the change in direction that we had at the front that's very aggressive. Is trying to dissipate it so that we don't have some of the problems with different drag situations at the end of the wing. So let's talk about what happens on these wings in a really minute scale, okay? So this right here, very small thing, is the fabled flat plate, okay? So when aerodynamicists, people who study aerodynamics, or fluid dynamicists, people who study fluids, or whatever you want to call them, when they talk about objects, they'll talk about blunt body objects. They'll talk about the flat plate. They'll talk about airfoils or maybe cars and just weird different shapes. So this is the flat plate theory. And the flat plate theory is very simple. It's just like an infinitely flat plate. What happens to an infinitely flat plate if the air doesn't have to divert around it? So I've depicted this with two arrows. We have free stream flow at the top and then flow that's going to come and hit our object. Well, what happens when the flow comes and it hits the object is it creates what's called a boundary layer. All right, this is a layer on the boundary of the object. So don't get confused with what a boundary layer is. It's not some sort of mythical beast. It's just a layer of air on the boundary of the object. And normally what the boundary layer looks like, or how close it is to the object, is this close, right? It's very close. It's like less than an inch off the object. So that's why we draw these lines very close to the airfoil. So that's the boundary layer. What's happening on a very small scale in the boundary layer is depicted by this drawing. And again, this is all theoretical. This is all just our human brains trying to conceptualize what's going on here. So when our flow hits our object, it actually slows to a halt here. This is a stagnation point. It stops here. Stagnation is stopping. So the flow will actually stop on the surface. And everywhere along the surface, the flow is theoretically stopped, right? If you come down to a very, very microscopic perspective of this, and you think about the interface between the actual airflow and the object, right next to where that stuff meets, right where the air meets the object, you have zero motion of the air. Okay? It actually fully stops. That's a little bit weird to conceptualize, so take a moment. As we go further into the free stream, as we go further up, we get faster and faster flow. So that's what this little gradient is. A gradient just meaning a difference, like it changes along this line. So in the top of the flow, we have very fast air, and then very close to our airfoil or our flat plate, we have very slow air. And this is the representation we're going to use to understand what's happening with our flow. Okay. Let's go to a curved object. So this is a curved object, all right? We have some boundary layer at the beginning of the curved object, air flowing and moving along the curved object, another boundary layer, and then on the far right, we have our third boundary layer. as we saw in previous videos, the pressure over here is a higher pressure than in the middle here. And then consequently on the other side, there's also a higher pressure. And this all has to do about air moving over this surface. So the pressures want to equalize. We have our object, our curved object moving this direction. All right, oh, look at that. This is really hard to draw with. I swear I'm good at drawing. I didn't steal these drawings. So here we go. We have a movement of us that's going to the left, which is creating airflow in blue going to the right. So we're creating these little boundary layers as we go along. As we're creating these boundary layers, something happens though. If we have too much of a pressure difference over to the right, then we get a flipped boundary layer. And let me come and zoom in on that little flipped boundary layer. So on the right here, there's a flipped boundary layer. You can see that on the top, you have free stream fast flow. And then at the bottom, you have like adverse flow. It's going the wrong direction. You have something you don't want. You want the air to continue to flow over your object or your airfoil, but you actually have flow going the opposite direction. And what happens here is because the flow conflicts with each other, it actually separates from the object. This is the very basics of flow separation. If you have a movement of air that's too aggressive, then the pressure change creates an adverse gradient and the boundary layers fight. When the boundary layers fight, they create a separation. And that's what we don't want. We don't want separated flow. We want flow to continue and be on our airfoil or whatever object we're tossing through the air, unless we're doing something really strange. Okay, let me get a big picture of what I'm doing here. All right, cool. So that's boundary layer separation. Let me get my wits about me. Okay, pressure drag, talked about laminar flow and the boundary layer. So the rest of this is getting into the meat of when we're talking about turbulence, because that's what we started this discussion with. Like, you're like, Lee, when are we going to talk about turbulence? You've been talking about all this other crazy stuff. We never talked about turbulence. This is when we get to talk about turbulence. Okay, so turbulence at its very basic form, an aerodynamicist would kill me for saying this, it's just some kind of mixing of flow, right? The flow has to mix and equalize. So here we are, smooth laminar flow, and here's our boundary layer. Now you can see on the right, I've created a bumpy portion of our surface. What happens in the bumpy portion? Well, the air has to do some kind of mixing, right? And if there's some kind of mixing, there's actually downward motion into these bumpy areas. When you create downward motion into the bumpy areas, in comparison to the smooth boundary layer, the bumpy boundary layer has a fatter bottom, okay? And all we're representing here is saying close to the surface, our boundary layer, our speed of our air at some distance from the airfoil or surface is faster. So closer to the surface, if you have bumpy surface, it's faster air. And that's what we want in certain scenarios. So some of you may be saying, hey, didn't we talk about skin friction drag the other day and how that was a bad thing and we don't want skin friction drag? Wouldn't that bumpy surface create skin friction drag? Yes, exactly. It would create skin friction drag. But because it gives us better flow at the bottom close to the airfoil, close to the surface, we actually get later separation. Our separation doesn't happen as fast. So that's a bonus. We're happy with that. So if we take a look at here, kind of a comparison, laminar turbulent flow, you can see how the turbulent flow would have a bigger bottom section here. Maybe I can zoom in. I don't have a lot of zooming accuracy, so bear with me. So all of this blue section is what you gain with turbulent flow. You get higher speeds closer to the surface of your airfoil or surface of whatever object you're throwing through air. And in some cases, that's very beneficial. We're happy with that. We like it. One particular case that is always quoted in this discussion with turbulent and Ooh, let me see if I can even get to it. Let's see here. It's actually really hard to get to it. Get over there. Okay. Here we go. So this is the golf ball case. All right. So this is the reason that the golf balls have dimples. If we look at a round, smooth circle, this is, you can think of it as a sphere or a ball or whatever, like a, not a basketball. What's smoother than a basketball? Like a lacrosse ball or something, or like a racquetball. There you go, racquetball. So here's a racquetball flying through the air, and we're creating some sort of pressure at the front of the object, just like we talked about before. And then at the back side of the object, a lower pressure depicted by a smaller p, and then some sort of flow that's being caused because of these pressure differences. So this is high pressure drag. Ooh, that didn't draw the way I wanted it to. This is a high pressure drag object because of its shape. Its shape creates high pressure drag. So if we look at a similar shape, and just bear with me, this is the same size, I promise. This is the same size object, but it's got kind of a bumpy surface. So what happens to this bumpy surface, just like we talked about before, the boundary layer can have faster flow closer to the object's surface. So we have faster flow close to the surface. And then as it comes around, it can stay attached to the object longer. So if we have attachment longer, then we have less of a problem at the back end of our object, less mixing, less pressure drag. However, what we lose here is our skin smoothness. So we get high skin friction drag. Again, we've talked about this before. In aviation, there's all sorts of give and take. So if you get one thing, it's not free. Nothing's free in aviation. You get high skin friction drag if you're trying to reduce that pressure drag, and vice versa. So there's a certain play that you have to do when you're designing your surface and your object and deciding, okay, this is a blunt body. This is like a nose or a nacelle or some sort of object that's not creating lift. You can use these kind of ideas to make it a little bit more efficient with your pressure drag, even though you're losing some with skin friction drag. So you can optimize what drag you're reducing and overall make it a better flying object, whatever it is, golf ball or not. All right, so just to review, turbulence, and readjust your brain here, because we started with turbulence in an airliner up in the sky dealing with flows mixing and flying from faster to smoother flow. And then we kind of moved into turbulent flow on an airfoil. And let me be really clear when we talk about this. This is the difference between laminar and turbulent flow on an airfoil. Turbulent flow is not separated flow. These are different things, okay? So turbulent flow does not mean it's separated. It just means that it's not as smooth and it has a different shape in the boundary layer. Once the flow separates from the airfoil, we get what's called a stall. And we can talk about that in a different video. I wanted to build on the basics here, but we basically lose lift, right? So when we get separated flow, we have a problem. Turbulent flow can actually sometimes help us as long as it's attached, right? So that's kind of the wording. We want attached flow. If it's laminar, it's smooth. If it's turbulent, it's bumpy. It's easy to think about turbulent as bumpy because when you sit in an airliner, it's bumpy in the airliner. You know, you're like, oh no, what's this pilot doing? He's really not doing anything. He's trying to fix it as much as you are. It's just the air around him. So again, in review, turbulence can be caused by flow mixing. That Kanata effect, that sucking creates the attached flow. And then a formulous body, a big blunt body, can create a lot of pressure drag, and smooth laminar flow can affect what the boundary layer looks like. And then our boundary layer determines if we're going to have attached flow along the wing or if we're going to have separation, which we don't want in most cases when we're actually flying. Other forms of turbulence, since we have a little bit more time, you can actually create turbulence with heating of the Earth's surface or deflection off of some body, like a building. That's called mechanical turbulence. And then that's essentially the main forms of turbulence. Some kind of mixing, some kind of heating, or it actually hitting something. Most of the turbulence that we get to experience as passengers on an airliner is based on the flow mixing. And then obviously, if we're dealing with a smaller scale airfoil, then we're dealing with that different kind of mixing that's occurring. And whether that's laminar, turbulent, attached, or separated, that kind of dictates how our airplane's going to fly. Okay, I don't know what we're going to talk about next time, so it's going to be a surprise. But thank you all for joining us here. I hope you're staying safe and healthy, and if you are going to work, I hope you're having fun going back to work and not hating it. I hope to see you all next week. Thanks for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.